Why is it that Palestine has always been a source of trouble to the world? Ever since the days of the Roman Empire, this little country on the east of the Mediterranean has been the scenes of wars and revolutions. Yet from the point in the south up to the north, it is only 200 miles long and nowhere more than 50 miles wide. Yet today the Jews are spending millions of pounds building a national home there. And on the other side, the Arabs, with 300 million Muslims at their back, are fighting fanatically for what they consider their natural rights in the country. What is it that causes so much trouble in Palestine? In thinking about Palestine, it is important to get rid of the idea that it has ever been a country as we understand that word. As you can see from the map, in the beginning of history, it was just a corridor between the mountains and the sea, joining the two great empires of Egypt and Babylon. And up that corridor, the trade of the two countries was carried in camel caravans like this. And in the plains of the corridor, where fought most of the battles that the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians waged between each other from the very earliest time. The other people which has always used this corridor are the nomads from the Arabian desert. Now a nomad is a person who has no fixed home, but lives in a tent and wanders about finding pasture for his flocks and herds. And his herds consist mostly of camels. And it was as one of these nomads that nearly 4,000 years ago Abraham came down from the north into Palestine. The book of Genesis is very accurate in its description of nomadic life. For instance, we read that Abraham passed through the land although the Canaanite was still living there. And that is exactly what happens today. When the Bedouin, as the nomads are called, cross the Jordan into Palestine, they don't stay there or settle in one place, but they move about, breaking and pitching their camp, just as Abraham used to. The camel is supposed to be the oldest domestic animal in the world, which perhaps accounts for the supercilious expression of this one. The sheikhs themselves, and of course Abraham was a sheikh, live in great tents. And their life is as simple today as it was in Abraham's time. For instance, the sheikh will sit through the heat of the day in the door of his tent, ready to welcome strangers or to settle the disputes of his tribe. There is a great sheikh's tent, one of the largest tents in Syria. And this man here today rules 10,000 people. These are two of his sons. Then hospitality to a sheikh is still as much part of his religion as it was 4,000 years ago. You remember that when Genesis says that 3 men of God visited Abraham, that he ran unto his herds and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to his young men, who killed it, and then dressed it and cooked it in butter and milk. And Abraham stood over his guests while they ate. And that is exactly what happens today when a sheikh wishes to honor a stranger. He will kill a sheep or a kid and give it to his young men, who skin it. And then they will cook it in sour milk, which is what you see in those great bowls. In Arabic it is called a leban. And afterwards in the evening, when the flocks and herds are driven into camp, all the young men who've been out with them since dawn come to the sheikh's tent and share the feast, because a meal at which meat is eaten is still in some sort a sacrifice. And then through the night the sheikh will sit telling stories of his ancestors, as Abraham must have told the stories he learned in Babylon. The story of Jacob wooing Rachel is so exact in its details that it might happen anywhere in Palestine today. You remember the book of Genesis says that Jacob went on his journey and came into the country of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in a field, and 3 flocks lying by it. And Jacob said to the shepherds, Know ye Laban the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And behold, even now his daughter Rachel cometh with his sheep. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, he went near. And he rolled away the stone that was at the well's mouth, and watered the flocks of Laban, his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel, and told her that he was Rebekah's son. And Rachel ran and told her father. And when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him. And Laban kissed Jacob, and embraced him, and took him to his own home. And then you remember the rest of the story, how Leah was first given to Jacob for a wife as the elder sister, according to Bedouin custom, and Jacob would have done service by looking after the flocks and herds of Laban. And then he would have had a great tent of his own, and become a sheikh in his turn with a large family. All these boys here are the sons of one sheikh. His wives live behind that great rug in what is known as the harem. And on the right in a minute you'll see the slaves. Bedouins still have slaves, although now they are really hereditary servants who have lived with the family for many years. They are, in law, free. This one here is the coffee slave pounding coffee. Jacob's family would have been at least as large as this. And then when Rachel joined his tent, she would have done the work of his house, grinding corn and sewing his clothes. And we read that Jacob increased exceedingly, and had much maidservants and menservants and cattle and asses, until it must have been that there was no room for him and Laban in the same country. And then Jacob set his wives and his sons upon camels, and came down into the land of Canaan. In Canaan he lived first at Shechem, and then at Hebron. And from Hebron he was driven down into Egypt by famine. We have not attempted to tell the story of Joseph, but Egypt outside the towns must be the same today as it was in his day. The pyramids to Jacob and his tribes would have been antiquities of about 1,000 years old. And the Nile, then as now, flooded the country twice every year, so that there might be famine in the rest of the Near East, there was always corn in Egypt, as Jacob had heard. The boats on the Nile, on which the corn is brought down from the Sudan and Upper Egypt, are called feluccas, and are much the same as the boats used at that time. And you remember that Joseph collected corn as the sand of the sea, until he ceased numbering. And you can tell from the primitive instruments that this old man is using, that their methods today are very much the same. And this granary just outside Cairo must look very much like the granaries which Joseph used. The Israelites themselves settled in the plain of Goshen, which is a fertile district on the east of the Nile Delta. And it is thought that when they first arrived, the pharaohs of Egypt were of the same Semitic race, called shepherd kings, and that the Israelites were allowed to lead the easy nomad life of the half-settled nomad. But then, as that verse in the Bible implies, a new Pharaoh drove out the shepherd kings and brought the Israelites under the law of the land, which has always included forced agricultural labor. And you can picture them using this very implement to irrigate the fields. It's called a shadoof. And its buckets tip the water up into the ditches, and then these wheels raise the water again to a higher level. It doesn't look very arduous work, but then you've got to remember that to a nomad, manual labor of any kind is not only a hardship, but an indignity. And at first, no doubt, this was really all the Israelites were complaining against. The bricks they made are still made and used in the same way. Mud is mixed with water, and then both are mixed with chopped straw. And the point of the straw is not only that it binds the brick, but that it prevents the mud from sticking to the builder's hand, and the mold from sticking to the ground. So you can see that when the Egyptians refused to supply straw any longer, and yet the Israelites had to supply the same number of bricks, that their work would have taken them more than twice as long. And this was an irritating hardship. And when that type of petty persecution turned to real oppression, then in the end the Israelites rebelled and fled. There you can see the straw very plainly. Tradition has it that the Israelites and crossed the top of the Red Sea down into the peninsula of Sinai, and that Mount Sinai is at the bottom. From there they would have turned north to Rephidim, and then up to Ezion-Geber, and so up to Kadesh. And at Kadesh they must have stayed for several years. And in thinking about the Exodus, try first to picture the tremendous change of scenery they would have met even on their first day. The Nile is a country of trees and shade and water, but now they were in a scrubby desert where any tree is almost startling in its loneliness. Then the desert in this part of the world plays queer tricks, and the wind whips up the sand into great spirals which travel over the ground at a tremendous speed, and to the Israelites must have seemed as if moved by invisible spirits. The land itself is twisted, and the wind howls in these great cavities and moans in the rocks. And as their camels' feet trod noiselessly over the sand, even at the end of their first day, the Israelites must have begun to feel something of the awe of their great adventure. Nobody knows quite where they camped, but the scene of their camping still happens every day in the desert. The leaders select a site a long way ahead and then make their camels kneel down. And the tribe, following in groups, every family with its camels, chooses their own site round the leaders, and the head wife makes her camel kneel, and then the bags are unloaded just where the tent is going to be raised up, and the tent is spread out over the baggage. Then the women hammer in the pegs. The women seem to do all the work, while the men sat and watched. And so the tent is raised up. Usually a woman works single-handed, and it took one woman about 20 minutes to raise a tent. In the evening, or just before sunset, the men would come in for their meal. And when there were no guests, and by now we were not considered guests, their fare would simply be a few dates and rice mixed with this sour milk called a leban. It doesn't sound very appetizing, but they certainly thrive on it. And they eat it, as you see, out of a bowl on the ground with their fingers. And then next day the whole process would start again. And you can tell from the length of the shadows that the camp has to be moving before dawn. And while the children sleep among the baggage, the women roll up the tents and put them on camels. And here the men did help. It was about the only time we saw them doing any work. The camels protest very loudly, and the bad-tempered ones often throw off their loads. This one got muddled up in his tent poles. When every camel's loaded, they're let loose and stand waiting for the head wife to lead the way off. And the children and the old women are put in litters made of cane. These antler-like litters belong to the sheikh's wives and are often covered with awnings. They look very picturesque, but one of our party travelled in one for some way and soon felt very seasick. Of course, in a picture, this looks rather picturesque and romantic, but the thing to remember is that this is one of the hardest and poorest lives in the world. This tribe here had been travelling for 4 nights of the week, with its wells running dry and its flocks and herds starving, and they are hardened to it. Imagine what it must have been for the Israelites, fresh from the Nile. Even these men, who had never lived anywhere else, had already fallen asleep twice while we were photographing. And think of the Israelites, with the pictures of the Nile in their minds, with its boats piled high with corn, and with all its water and shade and good things to eat. Is it any wonder that the congregation of the Israelites murmured against Moses and Aaron, and asked to be taken back to Egypt, and asked why they had been brought out into the desert to die, and left the flesh pots behind them? And then, at Marah, they came to a well. And the wells in the desert are very deep and are worked either by camels or by human beings. Beginning at sunrise, they walk backwards and forwards, pulling up the skin bucket on a long rope. And you can tell from the length of this rope that this actual well was more than 100 yards deep. It takes them all day to water their flocks and herds, so that wells are hardly a rest. Only at an oasis, as is said in Genesis, do they rest. And at an oasis, a nomad really seems to come to life and enjoy himself. And you can picture the Israelites at Rephidim and elsewhere, lazing about with their beasts, and just eating and drinking, and no doubt being as difficult to manage as they were on the march, although in another way. And one of the oases was Sinai. Now you're in an aeroplane, looking at the great granite mountains in that part of the world, one of which is undoubtedly Sinai. They stand sheer out of a dead flat desert for 2,000 and 3,000 feet. On top, these mountains are nothing but barren rock, dropping sheer for 2,000 and 3,000 feet. And you cannot imagine any more desolate or awe-inspiring place than the tops of the Mount Sinai, where Moses went up unto God. This is a model of the tabernacle made by a Dr. Schick in Jerusalem, according to the instructions in the Bible written about 1,000 years later. That is the Holy of Holies, and that is the great altar of sacrifice in the courtyard. The real tabernacle, as the name implies, must have been one of these great goat's hair tents, and the scene outside it when the Israelites prayed, not unlike this scene, although these men, of course, are Muslims. At Sinai, too, Moses organized the tribes under captains of hundreds and captains of 50, and gave them their laws. And that system is still working today. This sheikh here is sitting to judge the people just as Moses sat. And opposite him is the accused man, and on one side his witnesses, and on the other his accusers. And the sheikh is expounding the Mosaic law, and it is used even to try murder today. From Kadesh, the Israelites journeyed by the way of the Red Sea to encompass the land of Edom. They went south and then turned north through past Petra, through Moab, and up to a place called Heshbon, opposite Jericho. And there they crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. And the shading is supposed to represent the country they are thought to have occupied during the first century or so they were there. You remember that the way distressed the people because it was hard, and from the air we can get a small idea of it. This is Aqaba, a village of mud huts, and this, north of it, is the pilgrim route they must have struck, now a railway. It was the bridges of this railway that Colonel Lawrence blew up so assiduously in the Great War. North of that, they came to Petra. Now, there's no doubt there was a civilization at Petra in their time, although these temples were carved out of the red sandstone rock about 1,000 years later. You remember that Petra has been described as the rose-red city, half as old as time. North of that, they would have had their first hazy view of the Promised Land. Hazy because of the chemicals from the Dead Sea, which rise to a great height. And there in the distance are the hills of Judea. And on the east of that sea, on these mountains, Moses died. The Vale of Shittim is the lower half of the Jordan Valley between Jericho and the Dead Sea. As Genesis describes it, it is a volcanic plain full of slime pits and is still used by the Bedouin as a meeting place where they gather before crossing the Jordan every year into Palestine. For 2 or 3 days they come down there with their families and flocks and herds and camp on the river bank, waiting until they're collected before they cross. Then the horsemen and the camels going first, they cross over using all the many fords there are in that district. You'll see that the foals always run loose by their horses. Here are the families coming down. Now they're bringing the sheep down to the bank, and in a minute you'll see how they take them across. There's another foal running loose. The camels are sometimes a nuisance because at the sight of so much water they are apt to run amok and have been known to be lost for 3 days or more. All these herds, as a matter of fact, were got across quite safely. The Jordan's not very wide, nowhere more than 30 or 40 yards, but it flows swiftly. And here they are taking the sheep across, holding them by the ears. They go downstream in the shallows, and then when they get to the deep water, they swim across, still holding the sheep by the ears. The women and children go across on rafts made of goat skins blown up with air and joined together by poles. There are some Assyrian inscriptions of these rafts, which shows you how old they are. And now the camels are getting towards the other side. It takes 2 or 3 days for a big tribe to cross the Jordan, and the Israelites must have taken much longer, although no doubt the young men armed crossed in a single day. Once across the Jordan, the Israelites would have found themselves in a dead flat plain about 5 miles long, leading up to the oasis of Jericho. There you can see the oasis, that black streak under the mountains in the right of the picture. And it is said that Joshua had 40,000 men with which to attack the city. But today, archaeologists believe that Jericho never in its history withstood a siege, and that about this time its walls were destroyed by an earthquake. In a minute under the mountains, you'll see the remains of the city which Joshua took. There it is, that mound in the top of the picture. Those are the remains of the walls which were destroyed by an earthquake. And in thinking of the Promised Land, you mustn't compare it to England or Europe, but to the desert of Sinai through which we have just come. And then perhaps you'll see why it seemed to them a land of milk and honey. And so they began to settle. The camels which they had used for fighting were turned to the plough. And ploughing is another instance of the minute accuracy of the Bible, when it says, "He that putteth his hand to the plough." Because in Palestine the peasant ploughs with one hand, and in the other holds the goad. You can see the man holding the goad here. It must have taken the Israelites several generations to settle down, and the same process goes on today. These people here had only been settled about 20 years, and their methods of agriculture were the most primitive. Each year they scratched a new piece of ground and simply grew as much corn as they needed, and then next year they'd move on again to another piece of ground. And you can see how primitive their methods are. There's no doubt that this is the sort of life the Israelites led under the early judges, probably up to the time of Gideon. These women are gleaning just as Ruth must have gleaned in the fields of Boaz. In time, they would have learned to live in villages built of mud with mud plaster like this. The houses inside are very primitive, with no furniture at all, and the mud looks white under the sun. The orchards are mostly apple, olive, and almond. That's almond blossom. And the vines grow on the ground like this. And then in time also they would have learned to use the Canaanite cities as markets. And the scene must have been very much what it is now, when the peasants and Bedouin go in once a week to market. This man here is having his camel saddlebag filled with wool. Here's a general scene of the market, a great deal of talking, but not very much buying. The pots haven't changed notably in color or size since the time of Abraham. But besides learning to settle, the Israelites had to continue to fight. And the scene of most of their battles is this great plain of Esdraelon, which cuts the country in half. Now try and get the geography of it in your mind. On the left are the mountains of Gilboa. In the center, Mount Shunem. And to the north, coming into the picture in the distance on the right, Mount Tabor. And this plain was garrisoned by Egyptian and Canaanite cavalry, probably camel cavalry. And as the Israelites had no cavalry, they were in danger of being separated, the tribes in the north from the tribes in the south. Sisera, who is thought to have been an Egyptian, had his headquarters at this great fortress of Megiddo, which dominates the western end of the plain. And from there his bands went out marauding the fields and the villages of the Israelites, so that in the end Deborah and Barak were forced to gather the tribes to resist him. And they chose Mount Tabor for their headquarters. And you can see what an impregnable fortress it would have made in time of retreat, and how the steepness of its slopes must have given the impetus of an avalanche to Barak's charge when he made it. From Mount Tabor, he and his men would have watched the army of Sisera sweeping up the valley of the Kishon. And as they watched, there must have come up suddenly one of those thunderstorms which are so common in that country, and then the horses, frightened by the thunder and lightning, would have been put to final confusion by Barak's charge of the 10,000 men. While we were in Syria, we encountered just such a cloudburst as must have happened that day. It only rained for half an hour, but in that time great rocks and trees were hurled down into the valley, and what a few moments before had been or miles of smiling fields and orchards became a morass several feet deep in mud. And it must have been in a bog just such as this, suddenly made, that Sisera's army perished. The chief battlefield, however, of the Israelites was Mount Gilboa. Here you see another view of it, and just underneath in those woods is the well where Gideon chose his men. There in that wood there, it's since been planted up by a Jewish colony. And this plain in front is where the Midianites were encamped, whom he attacked. The Philistines confined Saul's kingdom to the mountains in the center of Judea. And once again, it was on Mount Gilboa that Saul met his end. Remember that Saul was defending this mountain, and when you look at the steepness of its slopes, it's very hard to see how he lost that battle. It took David, the shepherd warrior who succeeded him, several years to recover the lost territory. The shepherds in Palestine still all play musical instruments just as David did. And they still use slings, though not to kill giants. They use them to guide their flocks. We were told that they're so accurate that in the recent troubles they were really a nuisance to our aeroplanes when flying low. But David's greatest feat was the capture of Jerusalem and the founding of the kingdom. You remember that Solomon sent to Hiram, king of Tyre, 4 cedars of Lebanon, and these are the Lebanon mountains. The only cedars left there today are the little clump you see in the center of this great Kadisha gorge. Here's a closer view of the clump. There are about 300 trees there now. Few people know how high the Lebanon mountains are. They're over 10,000 feet and of course well above the snow line. Here's the other side of the gorge. The trees themselves are now museum pieces, some of them, like this one, 800 or 900 years old, and looked after by an old Maronite priest and a special Syrian keeper. In the center of the clump, too, there's a little Maronite chapel. Many of the trees are inscribed with the names of famous men who have visited them. Hiram is said to have floated the trees down to the sea by a river, and the river he must have used is the Orontes, which irrigates the great Syrian plain with these old water wheels. They pick up the water from the river and turn them into these troughs which carry them out to the field, or carry the water out, rather. The stones are something of a problem. The small stones of the temple, like these now in the foundations of the Jerusalem walls, were no doubt quarried locally, perhaps under the site of the temple itself, and the methods used would have been the same as those used here. But the larger stones, like those on the left, some of them 10 and 20 feet long and weighing several tons, are rather a mystery. The whole suggests grappling irons and armies of slaves, and the history of Solomon's reign rather bears this out. For the temple itself, we are comparing the area, the great square you see here from the air, with the models made by Dr. Schick in Jerusalem. Now you are looking due south from the northeast corner, and that is the northeast corner in Solomon's models. It was then a terraced sheep market. And here is the southeast corner looking towards the Mount of Olives as it is today. And that is the same corner in the models of Solomon's temple, and on the left his banqueting hall of cedar wood. The temple itself faced due east towards the Mount of Olives. And under it, the wall flanked the valley of the Kidron just as the wall does now, and you must picture the temple standing back in the center behind this wall. There is the wall under the temple in the model of Solomon's temple. There are no buildings as you look at the temple area from over the city now, But if you place in your minds that square opening in the right of the picture, you will also place the next view of the model. Here it is. That is the back view of the Solomon's temple. But the building of the temple ruined the kingdom, and after Solomon's death it was divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The Hebrew historians were right. As this stele of King Shalmaneser III shows, even the mightiest of their princes was only a vassal fit to do homage to his greater neighbors. The writing is cuneiform, and the translation No, the heroes of Hebrew history are not kings, but prophets. And in thinking of the prophets, we have tried simply to show the background against which they lived and taught. On the one hand, there was the life in the palaces, with their beds of ivory, where, in the words of Amos, men lay at ease in Zion, and drank wine out of great bowls, and chanted and danced to the sound of the viol. Excavations have shown that the palaces of Ahab's time must have been very much like these great oriental palaces today. And then outside in the streets, there was then as now the same contrast of blindness and poverty and disease. And it was scenes like these that made Amos and Hosea social reformers. They called back the people to the simple life of the shepherd, which they always felt was the true life of the country. Even more than the people, it was the country itself which colored the prophet's teaching. Remember that Palestine is a high backbone from which you can see many miles all round. And as you stand on the top of Mount Hermon and watch the sun rise behind the hills of Damascus, today as then, you see below you not one state or kingdom, but many states. And standing there, it is really possible to feel the force of the prophet's analogies. It is so plainly absurd that any idea of God could be confined to the territory of one small tribe. And rather it must be he that sitteth on the circle of the earth, and stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. From Mount Hermon and from Judea you are often above the clouds, which really do curtain off the country below. The political extinction of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah was inevitable. They were attacked from the south by Egypt and from the north by Assyria, and gradually Jerusalem itself was squeezed out. And we know a good deal what the Assyrians looked like from the great statuary they have left behind. This is King Ashur-bani-pal, one of the first Assyrian kings to cross the mountains and attack Syria. And he and his successors came in chariots with horses. These contemporary reliefs show their horses, and they're quite as good as any the Athenians ever drew. Then in 721, King Sargon captured Samaria, the capital of Israel. All that is left of it now are the remains of a later Roman city, and the Roman amphitheater, which is now an olive orchard. And then later came Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps the greatest of all the Assyrian warriors, and he captured Jerusalem. A woman pleading for her life. when the Jews under Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem, they found the walls of the city broken down and the gates thereof destroyed with fire. And under Nehemiah's leadership, they at once set about the task of rebuilding. And during that rebuilding, an event happened which is a direct link with today. The Samaritans, who then as now lived at Shechem, the ancient town between the mountains of Ebal and Zin, asked to be allowed to help. And when they were refused, they went back to Shechem and settled in the village which you see at the foot of this hill, and there began to carry on the religion of Moses in their own way. And their descendants have done so ever since. Every year in April, they hold the Passover on the top of this bleak mountain, just on the site where you see the road crossing it. And everything they do is done exactly as it is commanded in the book of Exodus. For a week before the feast, the whole population of the Samaritans camps on the top of the mountain in tents and booths, and booths are just small huts. There are only about 300 Samaritans left, because the laws of their religion, the first 5 books of the Bible, forbids them to marry outside. And then every day, before the feast, the priests, dressed all in white, go out onto the mountainside to pray. Most of the men are priests. On the eve of the Passover itself, they prepare the scaffolding for the sacrifice. And the sacrifice itself, sheep, are kept in a pen and cleaned specially every day. Pits are dug, this one to burn the parts of the sheep which it is forbidden to eat, and this one to actually cook the sacrifice. You notice the British police who have now to protect the Samaritans. And then, just before sunset, the sacrifice is cooked, the sheep being killed in batches of 7, and their blood allowed to run into the ground. They are now being killed just inside that circle. Meanwhile, water is heated to clean the carcasses afterwards, and the high priest, this is the high priest of the Samaritans, prays almost continuously. You see what a distinctive type of face they have. The carcasses themselves are cleaned largely by small boys. Here's a boy cleaning a carcass. Boys with long hair are the sons of priests. Their religion forbids them to cut it. The carcasses must be cleaned and gutted whole, and no bones broken. And while the boys hold the trestles, they chant in ancient Hebrew, and the priests themselves cut away the parts which the book of Exodus forbids them to eat. These they burn carefully over the pit you saw a little earlier. And if all this looks rather gruesome to you, remember that it is a very primitive religion, the religion of Moses, practiced, if not exactly as he practiced it, as it was practiced very soon after the Israelites reached Palestine. When the carcasses are ready, poles are driven through them to act as spits, and then they are let down into that pit where the fire has been prepared to be cooked. Here they are going down. And when they are let down, the pit is then covered over with wattles, and the wattles with mud. The mud, of course, to damp the flames, because the sacrifice is cooked by the ashes and not by the flames. You can see the spit sticking up through the mud. Now the pit is finally covered over. When the sacrifice is cooked, men go down into the pit and hand up the meat in baskets. then while the high priest prays, each family sitting round on the ground in a circle eats the Passover as it was commanded in the book of Exodus in a hurry. They use no implements, but they tear the meat off with their hands. They pray at intervals throughout the 24 hours, and it's a weird sight to see them, especially under a full moon, dressed all in their white, swaying backwards and forwards, their chant rising and falling, rather like a wind. In front of them on their deck chair is a copy of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, written, I think, 200 BC, and perhaps one of the oldest books in the world. It's written on papyrus. But besides its historical interest, this book is a symbol, because it was by just such a tenacity to the letter of a law that not only the Samaritans, but the Jews preserved their identity after they returned from Babylon. Alexander the Great was only 18 when he crossed the Bosphorus and began his great march of conquest. He beat Darius first at Issus, went south to Alexandria and took Egypt, returned, taking Palestine on his way, beat Darius again at Arbela, and so to the Indus. And in the wake of Alexander's armies came all the culture of Greece. Remember that to the Jews any graven images of any kind were forbidden. Yet now on all sides they found themselves surrounded by some of the finest sculpture the world has ever seen. Then to the Jews, beauty is largely a thing of the mind, and life lived in books. Yet now, all over Syria, they saw springing up perhaps the fullest example of social existence the world has ever known, in the form of the Greek city-state. These ruins are actually the ruins of Palmyra, a little north of Palestine, and built a little later than that time. But they are a very fine example of the architecture of the Greek city-state. And as you bear in mind these ordered ruins and the planned city, compare them with the narrow, twisted streets of Jerusalem in which the Jews live and which they love. And then perhaps you will feel something of the impact of Hellenism on the Jewish mind. The last kingdom of the Jews was called the Hasmonean or Maccabean kingdom, and was so fanatically religious that even on its coins they would have no graven images, just the gate of the temple on one side and the altar of incense on the other. Here is a modern coin of the same value, about 2 shillings. Before Pompey, the Roman Empire was established on both sides of the Mediterranean, and after his campaigns, it encircled the whole sea until Jerusalem and Judea were included. And to give some idea of the might of Rome, we have shown the great temples of Baalbek up in the Lebanon Valley just north of Palestine. Though now these temples are ruins, everything in them is the largest of its size in the world. These are just the foundation stones of those great pillars you saw, and you can tell their size from the man. The pillars above them are 75 feet high, and above them again a cornice 20 feet high. Here is a piece of the cornice on the ground. How stones this size were got up nearly 100 feet, nobody quite knows. Then in the wall outside there are the 3 largest stones in the world. A 4th is still in the quarry, and each of them is the size of an ordinary cricket pitch. Nobody knows how they could move these. What is quite clear is that a people that could build on this scale would not long tolerate the opposition of a little sect like the Jews. There is very little in Bethlehem which is as it was in the time of our Lord, but among that group of buildings on the left is the Church of the Nativity, and you can see from the air how the city stands on a hill and is in a country of olive orchards. Then we have not tried to portray in any way the life of our Lord, but simply to show some of the circumstances of it which still exist. As you can see, babies in Palestine are still swaddled. The doctors now say that this is very bad for them, but it is done in order to help their mothers carry them more easily. Then soon after our Lord was born, his family must have moved from Bethlehem and crossed the mountains of Judea to Nazareth. They would have travelled on donkeys like these people here and used Herod's roads, the lines of which the road still takes. Once over Judea, they would have crossed the plain of Esdraelon and so to the hills of Nazareth. And in Nazareth, Jesus led the boyhood of which we know so little. But from his later teaching and analogies, we can tell some of the scenes he must have witnessed. For instance, he must often have watched his mother making bread, and have noticed how leaven spreads and binds the flour. It is not known for certain whether there were schools in the time of our Lord, but there were very soon afterwards. And in any case, from his great knowledge of it, he must have read the law very diligently as a boy. Jerusalem is still always crowded during the week of the Passover. This is the street leading down to the temple area. And the temple area itself, although not the same to look at, does cover the same extent. And you can see from the crowd how easy it would have been for a boy to get lost. Today, the imams sit in council rather as the rabbis must have then. And when he returned home, Jesus must surely have adopted the profession of Joseph and become a carpenter. This man here is making a plough. You see how he holds the wood with his toe. The pattern of the plough hasn't changed in Palestine since before the time of Abraham. It looks primitive, but in fact it's one of the best implements for the very shallow soil up on the hills there. That's the farmer who is having the plough made. The Jordan has many lovely stretches which have been used for baptism both before and since the time of our Lord. The last occasion was just before the war, but then some Baptists were shot at, and since then it has been discontinued. The desert into which he went is known as the Yeshimon and is one of the fiercest deserts in the world. It begins down in the Jordan Valley below sea level and rises 3,000 and 4,000 feet to the mountains of Judea. As you can see, it is quite barren. Nothing can grow there, and not even the Bedouin can live there. And it is so hot that sometimes when the Bedouin cross it, the soles of their sandals are scorched. Yet our Lord spent many days and many nights there alone. Down at the south end, there is a great flat-topped mountain, which is known as the Mount of Temptation. There it is, and it is there that it is thought our Lord renounced the kingdoms of this world. And in Galilee, he came to Capernaum. Nobody is quite certain where the site of Capernaum is, but it is thought to be this little promontory at the north end of the lake, which is now a pleasant place overgrown with eucalyptus trees and with a hospice kept by a German father. There are three sorts of fishing on the Sea of Galilee. One, the cast net, used by one man, the drag net, used by several, and both of these near the shore, and then the sea net, which is let down from a boat in deep water, and then hauled in on land by the fishermen together. And all these three types of fishing are known to have been in use at the time of our Lord. Here the men are hauling in the sea net. It's very heavy, and sometimes the line of them stretches a quarter of a mile inland. These men are overhauling their nets in a boat, just as James and John, the sons of Zebedee, must have when Jesus called them to be his disciples. And this family is doing the same thing on the land. The boats which our Lord used came from the little port of Tiberias, just as they do today. Tiberias is not often mentioned in the Bible, but is a town lying in a hot plain on the southwest corner of the lake. And above it on the skyline, the ruins of Herod's castle still stand. Bethsaida is thought to be a flat plain on the north of the lake, just where the Jordan entered it. Now it is really only a Bedouin camp, but it may have been the scene of the miracle of the 5,000. From there, Jesus went into the Decapolis, the country of the Greek city-states, and he may easily have visited Jerash, much of which is still standing. The ruts in the road look as if they were made yesterday, and in a minute you'll see the marks of the chariot wheels where they came round the corner. From Jerash he went north again, past Mount Hermon to Caesarea Philippi, and some people think that it was on Mount Hermon that he was transfigured. Caesarea Philippi, now known as Barneas, is a little village at the source of the Jordan at the foot of Mount Hermon, and there this temple to Pan was built just 20 years before our Lord went there. And no doubt he read this Greek inscription. Behind Barneas, the country is mostly lava rock, and it may have been these rocks he had in mind when somewhere near here he turned to St. Peter and said, "On this rock will I found my church." From Barneas you look right down the Jordan Valley towards Judea and Jerusalem. And we know that on his way to Jerusalem came again into the plains of Jericho. And from Jericho he would have passed once more the Mount of Temptation, and then taken the road up through the Judean mountains. Halfway he would have come to the inn of the Good Samaritan, the only dwelling in 20 miles of desolation, and a dwelling surely with memories for him. From its doors you see the towers of Jerusalem on the skyline, and so he would have climbed over the back of the Mount of Olives and down the other side to the holy city. And you must picture Solomon's temple as you saw it in the model instead of that great mosque. Jerusalem no doubt again crowded for the Passover and full of Roman soldiers. But though there are many holy sites there today, scarcely one of them looks as it can have looked when he saw it. Perhaps alone the steps of the Via Dolorosa are as they may have been when he walked up them to the cross. Not long survived the crucifixion. Under the Emperor Titus they rebelled, and Titus captured Jerusalem and commemorated his victory on his triumphal arch at Rome. Then about 50 years later, the Jews rebelled again, and the Emperor Hadrian captured Jerusalem the last time and razed it to the ground so that not one stone was left upon another. Meanwhile, Christianity had become a sect in the Roman Empire and was being persecuted, and the scene of many of the martyrdoms was the Colosseum at Rome. Now you are inside the Colosseum, and in a minute on the ground floor you will see the cages from which the lions were let loose upon the early Christians. There are the cages in the middle. But though the empire began, it was through the great trade routes of the empire that Christianity first spread. This map shows you one of St. Paul's journeys from Antioch. He went north through Asia Minor to Troas, crossed over to Macedonia, to Thessalonica, to Berea, and then went south to Athens and Corinth. And from Corinth he crossed the sea again to Ephesus, and so went back to Caesarea, Jerusalem, and Antioch. And when the Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as the religion of the empire, churches sprang up everywhere. Great ruins like this, once a vast Byzantine church, but now miles out in the desert from anywhere, give one an impressive idea of the extent of the early church. It is a weird sight to see this beautiful brickwork now surrounded by nothing but a few Bedouin tents, and only the home of hawks and lizards. In Jerusalem itself, Queen Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can see it here, the two black domes in the center of the picture, and just to the left, the square Crusader tower. In this closer view, you see the scaffolding which is now shoring up the building because it is thought to be falling down. You also notice how the roof of the church merges with the roof of the city and is built all over the site of the hill, or what is thought to be the site of the hill of Calvary. But more than anything today, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre reflects the divisions which so soon split the early church. Under this great rotunda, or dome, 5 different churches hold 5 different services in their 5 different languages at the same time. And they all own separate sections of this dome. Each pillar is owned by a different church. And unfortunately there have been many disputes as to the rights of property here. The haze is the haze of incense, which sometimes is so thick it makes it impossible to see across. And on the left, the tomb itself is coming into the picture, fronted by great candles. The services you see are the great Easter ceremonies filmed for the first time in the history. This is the Latin Mass in front of the Holy Tomb itself. The Latins in Jerusalem are, of course, the Roman Catholics. Here is the Latin Patriarch. The Greek Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, whom you will see in a round mitre, is the Bishop of Jerusalem. The priests are in cloth of gold, and they process night and day through Holy Week. The Armenians in their pointed hoods with great beards. Their robes are some of the most beautiful of all. These are crimson and cloth of gold. and they carry palms for a procession on Palm Sunday. This Syrian Orthodox bishop is reading the lesson in Aramaic, the language which our Lord himself used. And these are the Copts, the successors of the ancient Church of Egypt, entering the tomb. You notice the great candles flanking the door. These 5 churches hold their ceremonies inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Outside on the roof and at night, the Abyssinian Church is allowed to hold its own services. And these perhaps are the most picturesque of all. To the syncopated beat of the African drum, umbrellas of state once used at Addis Ababa are carried round and round the roof of the rotunda, while the priests themselves search symbolically for the body of our Lord. And the abbot follows in a mitre of solid gold. Yet it was just the divisions which produced these several churches, which also, in about the 7th century, provoked the reaction of Islam. We can still catch something of the spirit of Islam from the great processions they hold today in memory of their victories. This procession here is in honor of the prophet Moses, who is a Muslim prophet as well. And you can tell from the way they are brandishing their swords how fervent the Muslims still are. When the Caliph Omar conquered Jerusalem, he built this great mosque known as the Dome of the Rock on the site of Solomon's Temple and instead of the Church of Justinian. And from then, with the brief interval of crusades, the minaret dominated the holy city until the Great War. Pilgrims were still always allowed to come to the city, the Jews to wail at the foundation stones of Solomon's Temple and bemoan their past glories, the Christians to attend the ceremonies in the courtyard or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here is the Greek Orthodox Patriarch blessing the pilgrims. And the pilgrims themselves are wiping the dust from the dais onto their handkerchiefs to take away with them as mementos. The castle of Shobek, 50 miles south of the Dead Sea, and built on the top of a barren mountain. This is Belfort, nearly 300 miles to the north, on the Litany Valley, and that is the back view. Athlete, 50 miles north of Jerusalem on the coast, and visited by Richard Coeur de Lion. It was largely destroyed by an earthquake. And this castle we have been unable to identify, but it is miles away from anywhere in the desert, and today I think visited only by aeroplane. Yet it gives one an idea of the loneliness of these Crusader outposts. But in the 12th century, Saladin conquered them again, and from that time onwards, the minaret citadel of the Holy City, and ruled it until the Great War. Allenby's army followed the route of the ancient Egyptians up the plains from Gaza. And on the other side of the Jordan, the Arabs under Lawrence and Faisal moved up in support. And in 1917, Jerusalem itself was captured, and since then has been under a British mandate. But the point of the mandate is not that it is British, but that under it, Palestine has once again become a country of ideas. Nationalism has brought the Jews back, and the Zionists have built New Jerusalem. If you carry your mind back to the jumble of roofs round the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is only half a mile away, you will get some idea of the contrast between the old and the new city. This is a typical Zionist house just going up. And these are typical Zionists. Queen Mary Avenue. And Tel Aviv, the first purely Jewish city in the world, with a beach that will soon rival Honolulu. Under the same impulse of nationalism, The Arabs too have made great strides since the war. With British tuition in the plains, they are learning to use modern methods of agriculture. In the towns, their boys are getting as good an education as boys get in Europe, mostly in Christian schools. And the girls, whose mothers would have spent their lives under the veil, are beginning to lead the same sort of lives that girls lead in Europe. The modern Arab, in fact, is a cultivated, educated person and a rival to the Zionist. In the center there is Mr. Khalidi, ex-mayor of Jerusalem, sent to exile in the Seychelles. This colony is called Nahalal and is built on the spot where Deborah and Barak fought Sisera. It is built like a cartwheel to help cooperation, and it is one of the cooperative colonies. In it, every farmer owns his own backyard and does all his manual and domestic labor for himself. He lives with his family in an up-to-date bungalow, and as you see, it's a normal family existence. Here's the farmer doing his own washing up. And this is his wife. And now you come to the center of the cartwheel, to the milk depot. And here, after it has been weighed and tested for quality, the farmer says goodbye to his milk, which is then taken over by a central organization which does all the communal buying and selling. That is where the cooperation comes in. It's the domestic and manual labor that is done by the farmer and his family. Now, in contrast, here is a communal colony built with a palisade because of troubles with the Arabs. This palisade was built in a single day. Inside, the colonists begin in straw houses or in tents, and they own absolutely nothing themselves, not even money. The children do not know what a coin is. In the more advanced or older communal colonies, a very high standard of living has been achieved. This one is called Giva, and here are the children's buildings. From the first week of their lives, all the children are brought up in the same building and looked after by 7 or 8 of their mothers in turn. The children's night nursery. The 2- and 3-year-olds having a shower bath. The day nursery. Of course, a great deal of money has been put into this experiment, but these are the children of peasant farmers, and there is no question that their standard of living is higher than that of peasant farmers elsewhere. In Giva, the work is shared equally by men and women, and the vineyards are famous. Many of the grapes come to Europe. In contrast to the family meal you saw in the last colony, this is the communal dining room, which includes many types for all its meals. Everybody meals together. And work is arranged by a committee, and nobody necessarily knows what he will be doing from one day to the next. Instead of the farmer's wife washing up, here is the communal laundry. We don't want to emphasize the clash, but what we would emphasize is that the ideas behind it are passionately believed in and heroically fought for. Many of these Jews have been killed. And on the other side, men like the former Mufti of Jerusalem, on the right, has risked his life and gone into exile for the principles in which he believed. And to these people, Orthodox religion does not appear quite as it does to us. This is the ceremony of the Holy Fire in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fire is supposed to descend miraculously to the tomb and is then passed out to the crowd. And the congregation stampedes as it tries to light its tapers from the sacred flame. Every year the police have difficulty in keeping order. Of course, this is only one small aspect of Christianity, yet it is an aspect of which modern Jews and Arabs in Palestine see perhaps most. And it's not surprising that they don't look either to Christianity or the old religions to solve their problems. But outside the city, there still stands the Garden of Gethsemane, which is one of the most beautiful and peaceful places in the world. And if Christianity has a message for the modern world, it's only here that its inspiration must be found.